Hello, YouTube. Welcome to today's show. I'm interviewing Micah Goldwater, who's over in Australia. So that's why it's a bit of a different time than usual. And do you want to just briefly introduce yourself first? So you're at University of
Yes,
Australia and
I'm at the
what it is that you do.
I'm at the
Oh,
University of
Sydney.
Sydney in the School of Psychology. I'm a cognitive scientist who researches learning, thinking, and how beliefs are formed and changed. Yeah.
Awesome. So we were talking a little bit just before we went live, and I was saying the reason that I think a lot of the people who watch my stuff will be interested in what you're doing is because I touch on a lot of topics that are to do with sort of quite fundamentalist sort of belief formation and irrational belief persistence, and with respect to like extreme political and religious beliefs. And you lead a sort of research group or a research node over there at the university, which is to do with fighting truth decay. Could you briefly sort of talk about what it means to fight truth decay? You know, what the kind of goals of setting up this group are?
So thanks. So we're part of the Charles Perkins Center in Australia, which is actually it's an interdisciplinary health focused research center where and so a lot of what we're looking at is particularly around health sort of beliefs, but also my research, I'm personally just as interested in political and other kinds of things. Though the center, as part of this health institute, we're sort of looking more in that sort of space. But things like vaccine hesitancy, those kinds of things are very much a part of that. But with the node, what we're doing is I'm on this as a psychology researcher. I tend to look at this from the side of the sort of information consumer, where let's say you're on social media, you come across some post about how masks don't work or whatever, and what happens and how do you interpret that and things like that. But the node, we're also bringing together a bunch of researchers who look more on the science production side, because there's this idea that science is very self-correcting, but it turns out that doesn't just happen on its own. You have to be actively pursuing that. And so we also have people who look at how, for example, pharmaceutical companies bias research with their funding. So when they don't disclose conflicts of interest, so for example, a woman from the group recently, Barbara Mintzes, recently published this paper on how there's just more. If you look at like the number of public records of researchers working with pharmaceutical companies and the number of conflicts of interest disclosed in papers, there's just not enough conflicts of interest being disclosed. Right. And a former person of this group who's gone back to the UCSF in the US, Lisa Barrow, she was doing a bunch of work showing that there was a bunch of research showing that sugar is not that bad for you, and it was all sponsored by Coca-Cola, right? And Coca-Cola was actually had people like following her around, right? So there is stuff on the science. So we're looking at both the science production side, how to increase transparency, how to we improve the scientific process such that by the time it actually gets to the consumer, it's trustworthy, right? Because sometimes you get a news report and everyone and the journalists are trying to do a fine job, but they're doing something that's actually not good in the first place, right? And then we're sort of bringing that research together with the research on more my side of things and other people who, so for example, media and digital sort of culture researchers who look at like the sort of governance of social media platforms and how that leads to spread of information. And I, on the psychology side, look at like how people interpret the information. So we're trying to bring all these different things together, and hopefully having this interdisciplinary approach of bringing the different things together will sort of, lead to more than the sum of its parts in terms of us just doing these things on our own. But some of that's just academic structure stuff that people may not be that interested in. But that's sort of what we're doing. And of course, this work became during the pandemic. We were already sort of doing this work, and then during the pandemic, this became, suddenly had a much bigger spotlight on it when you started noticing people over the world, objecting to what people might have thought was a reasonable things to do, like mitigation measure, risk mitigation measures to save people's lives seemed like a reasonable thing that everyone would sign on to. And then as we saw in the US particularly, but in Australia to a lesser degree, lots of people be quite rejecting of these measures, and we're doing a bunch of work around that more recently. Yeah, I think that's a decent summary of it.
What one of the phrases used to sort of describe what the group's doing, or the research node, I think, like, research node is like kind of new phraseology to me, so I don't know if that but one of the phrases used is epistemic crisis, and I was wondering if you could say, what does epistemic crisis mean to you as someone in that kind of research group?
All right, yeah. So I mean, people have used this particularly around in the US, where where the goal, so the part of that has to do with like sort of disinformation campaigns to a certain extent, right? So in in a certain political context, I mean, so this guy Stephen Lewandowski is maybe the most prominent in the cognitive science world, talking about some of this stuff. So we sort of talk about in the past when politicians were lying, right? It was very like clearly about some particular cover up or something, right? Bill Clinton may have lied about his affair because if people kind of specifically knew about that affair, that would be that wouldn't be good for him personally. Right? There were sort of reasons to lie about that specifically. But what appeared to happen more and more with the whole like alternative facts types of discussion seems to be much, this seems to be much more of just we're just kind of lying all the time just so that no one trusts anything. Right? There's a kind of, we don't want to just have these very specific lies that are beneficial to us. We want to create an environment where typical sort of typical kinds of sources of institutional, the CPC, of course you just trust the CPC, right? Why wouldn't you? Or right? So, if you're trying to sort of undermine trust in all kinds of things, then you can get your agenda across. There was this interesting paper. I mean, this predates a bunch of this stuff, but there's this interesting paper from I think 2012 looking particularly at climate change, where if you look at, so how might you solve climate change, right? Well, a bunch of countries have to work together, and you might have to temporarily do something bad for your economy, right? You might have to go, or according to certain measures of economic growth, right? Some people have argued that you shouldn't even think about economic growth as the measure of anything. But if you're in the paradigm that growth is what you need, you're going to have to take this hit on your growth. Now, to do that, you're going to have to trust that someone else is going to also do that, right? So if you just say, okay, we're going to take the hit, then, oh, what if China tricked you and they're not going to do that they're going to just power ahead using all the energy and all the fossil fuels they can, and then suddenly you're losing the competition. And so there was this paper sort of showing that just sowing seeds of doubt about anything about the process, about climate change science, about anyone else's tensions, reduces people's willingness to sacrifice for cooperation. Right. And so, so if you're just trying to get rid of, right. So if you're, so just sort of, and then you can advance your agenda, which might be making as much money from fossil fuels as possible, or whatever it is. Right. So sort of just sort of making people not trust stuff allows you to sort of put your agenda forward, as one sort of way to think about it. Though I do say, I mean, it's interesting around this thing, epistemic crisis, because on the one hand, we have this very vocal, kind of anti-vax and don't believe, don't trust the CPC, these very sort of vocal communities of that. And it's very, at least in the US and some other places, it's very sort of correlated with political party and these other types of value systems. But you actually showed that in many places, trust in science has actually increased over the course of the pandemic, right? And so, and so sometimes it's hard to square those two types of things, where we have this, we have some group of people, right, who are kind of denying science, and now also we have these people who are going, wait a second, we were fine with all these other vaccines, and now that we hate the COVID vaccine, we have to go back and not like those other ones. right? Because they could have resolved the cognitive dissonance in the other direction, which was like, actually, we already are fine with these other vaccines. Let's go forward and like the COVID one. But instead, they're going, actually, we shouldn't be getting these other vaccines, even though we had no problem with them for the past 20 years, right? So you're sort of seeing that. So you're seeing this type of you're seeing sort of minorities of people going in this direction, but you're still overall seeing this increase in trust in science because of how kind of effective certain types of things, especially when you have public leaders who are clearly communicating things. I think that's
that's
yeah.
So in terms of what's kind of driving some of these issues to occur in this like epistemic crisis, what are some of the proposed causes from the types of like research you do? So either in terms of psychology or sociological explanations.
Oh, right. Yeah. So some of this stuff, so some of these things may not be big enough to lead to what we might call a crisis, because some of these things are just kind of part of normal psychology in a certain way. So the way I think about, so if we're just trying to say endorsing of false beliefs or pseudoscience. Now, I sometimes want to make this clearly kind of differentiate this from, say, religious beliefs, because religious beliefs are this totally other thing where your reason for believing in it isn't evidence, right? You can, faith, you kind of say, right, like, I have faith in this. The fact that there, the point is that there isn't, you can't just go up to God and shake his hand and know whatever, right? You have to have faith even though you don't have that type of thing, right? But there's other kinds of things where, right, that's different than, say, climate change denial, anti-vax types of things, where people, even the deniers think there is good evidence, right? They don't think they don't think they're acting on faith. They think they're acting on other type, right? On evidence, things like that, right? So for now, I'm just going to talk about these types of things. So I think there's a few different factors that all kind of lead. Some of them are just kind of purely cognitive, for lack of a better term, where there is nothing really in our minds that make us differentiate different kinds of ideas, right? So sometimes we think, oh, well, sometimes we think I believe in science. So one way people have sort of asked this question to me before is, why does the current generation, who is, definitely, let's say you have young people who are pro-vax, want to do something about climate change, right? They don't go to church, right? They're very kind of secular people, but they like astrology, right? Or there's something, like that, right? And then people go, well, how do all these things happen? Isn't this kind of some weird irrational inconsistency? We'll say, well, there's actually nothing in our minds that force us to demarcate which of these ideas are like scientific, which of these theories aren't scientific. And I have to make sure they stay sort of separate. People actually integrate these kinds of things all the time. And some of these things are also religious kinds of ideas. So there's this notion called explanatory coexistence, where people just sort of blend scientific with non-scientific things into a single explanation. Because people do try to explain, we naturally always want to sort of explain things, whether it's our social lives or our the physical world or whatever. And this term came up first. So Christine Laguerre did this research where she was in rural South Africa. This is now a bit after the sort of peak of the AIDS crisis. And in this rural area, there was very little education, very little sort of formal education. And there was this idea before any came in that you got AIDS from witchcraft. Okay. And then people came in and gave them this education around a virus, around how sexually transmitted disease, how you get this virus and things like this. And then Christine did this work where she went to see, now that they've had this education and it's years later, what's their explanation for HIV transmission? And a lot of them had integrated these two things. The science didn't replace the religious thing, or the science sort of got, it didn't really say, well, I got you get HIV from having sex with a infected woman, but you were attracted to that affected woman because of witchcraft, right? So why else would you be attracted to someone who was infected, right? And I realized I did the same kind of thing, though it seems less obviously kind of strange to the Western eye, right? But this is not something that's just unique to Africa. That this is something that we all do around catching a cold, right? So if so there's a common sort of belief that like being cold makes you catch a cold, right? But there's actually not really any evidence for that, right? So, however, you catch a cold from a virus. I did this kind of thing where, like, I think I had just integrated, well, well, being cold makes your immune system weaker, and so you're more susceptible to the virus. And this sounds totally reasonable to me as someone who's not an expert in, in anatomy and the immune system and all these kinds of things. Now, it does turn out there's this one paper that has shown that viruses replicate faster in mice who are like colder, but this is like one little bit, and no one's like beliefs are actually because they read this paper. Like no one's read this paper, right? That's not sort of why, right? So we're sort of blending, so we all the time kind of blend these different things together and don't even really notice that we're doing it unless like someone sort of forces it, right? And part of it is because, or think about the flat Earth, or we all might laugh at flat earthers, but then you're on I remember I was on a flight from Chicago to Tokyo, and we were going over the Arctic, and I was like, what are we doing? That doesn't make sense. Then I was like, oh wait, no, yes it does, because the Earth is is round and a sphere, and it makes sense that you would go over the Arctic. But because we still think about the world, because the two-dimensional map representation of the world is useful for our navigation almost all the time, right? It's only what in these contexts of, right? So we have these sort of not the real, so we have these things that the varying level of not being the kind of true science or whatever at varying degrees that we use because they're still kind of useful to us, and there's nothing kind of stopping us from doing so. And like in the astrology example, for example, what are people using it for? They're using it for things like, oh, should I date this person? Or why didn't that relationship go well? Right? That's not in conflict with their climate change belief. The science of climate change has nothing to do with whether or not your relationship would go well, unless you don't want to date a climate denier, right? But besides that, it has nothing to do with it. And so each sort of thing can be, fairly compartmentalized and then blended until something really forces you not to sort of stop blending them, right? So that's one bit. That's like a kind of cognitive thing where there isn't even any kind of social motivation, type of thing, right? Then there's this whole other realm of the kind of social values and social identity aspect to these.
Just prior to that part,
yeah,
would you be able, could you sort of highlight how that kind of model of blending explanations maps into the case of maybe some of these things like COVID conspiracism or anti-vax conspiracism or something like that? So what other sort of competing theories that people are blending?
Right. And so one thing is interesting. So before we even get to that, I actually even showed that people do this kind of blending where it was all just scientific because so remember early on the idea was that that COVID spread on the surface, right, in droplets, right? Everyone's like washing their groceries, right? And that came out first. So often the thing that sometimes you just can't get rid of the first thing you hear, right? And then people end up blending them. So I sort of shows that a lot of people a year and a half later have this kind of blending of it spreads on surfaces and it spreads in the air, even though the spreading in the air was supposed to replace the idea of spreading on the surface, right? But people don't, but you still see, you go to a gym, we wipe down our weights every day, right? Anyway, yeah. So then you're talking about the conspiracy. So there's another aspect of, so then you're talking about things like conspiracy type theories and, well, so there's another aspect where people start piecing little bits together, and it sounds pretty good, right? So I'll give you an example from the kind of vaccine and autism case, right? Where there's where one of the things that makes something kind of pseudoscience rather than just say a religious thing is that the pseudoscience tends to take individual bits from science and then kind of put them together in a way that doesn't really work. So for example, with vaccines and autism, there's this explanation that that stuff in the vaccine affects your gut biome and we do know, well, that might be even true. I'm not sure if that part's true, but that might be. It is true that there's some neurotransmitter that are produced in like the microbiome, but that sort of the microbiome plays an important role in producing some neurotransmitter, right? And so there's this explanation where the way in which vaccines could cause autism is because it's like messing with your microbiome. You're then not making the right neurotransmitters, and then autism is developed in the brain because like you're not making the right neurotransmitters, right? And you're going through that and you're like, that kind of sounds plausible, right? Also, most of us actually have very shallow understandings of everything. There's this other aspect, so sort of complementary to the explanatory coexistence is this thing called the illusion of explanatory depth, where we tend to think we have deeper knowledge about things than we do. So one example of this is you just ask people, do you know how a toilet works? And they say, yes. And then you say, how does it work? Explain it to me. And they go, oh, I guess I don't really know how it works because all I know is that like I hit the button and the things go away, right? And so because most of our because we successfully interact with toilets all the time, it gives us a sense that we understand how they work.
Right.
Right.
So it's the idea that it's actually like familiarity is something rather than explanatory depth in those sorts of cases.
Right. Yeah. And especially because a lot of our kind of cause and effect thinking is not for deep explanations, but just to sort of intervene and have an outcome happen. Right. I can or the car, like you might think you know how the car works because you can get in it and take it somewhere. Right. So the fact that you use it in the way that you want to, you intend on using it in some way and it works that way, it gives you a sense that you understand it at a deeper level. And there's this work sort of showing also that this is especially true when we know some other people in our community do understand it, right? There's a mechanic, even though I don't understand how a car works, I'm aware that there's a guy at the mechanic shop down the street who does understand how it works. And people are actually quite bad at distinguishing what they know from what someone else in their community knows. And it kind of leads to this overall sense of you have this inflated sense of knowing. Right. Yeah. So a lot of these different pieces are coming together where people are kind of happily blending things that don't really go together, also because they don't quite realize how shallow their understanding is. So even understanding is, so think about even like the case of the accurate model of the, of COVID spreading in the air, right? That's really all I can, how much more can you say about it? Oh, it spreads in the air and that's why you need masks. And that's why it's better to be outside than inside. And that's kind of like the entire depth of our knowledge, right? Unless you're at, there's slightly more to it where because it's in the air, it has to do with the sort of density of virus particles outside is much lower than inside. But that's not even sort of part of the conversation. We just kind of say it spreads in the air, and that's like as far as we go, right? So then there's those those kinds of bits, and then so that's sort of the cognitive, the kind of what we might call the cognitive side. And then there's like the social and emotional stuff that starts coming in, right? So the conspiracy, so often what happens with conspiracies is one key aspect is that people endorse conspiracies when they feel like they have less control in their lives, right? So having less control in your life, so uncertainty and in a sense of a lack of agency is one of the primary causes of anxiety, right? Anxiety often is a kind of feeling of there being a threat sort of based in your own sense of a lack of agency in your life. And so, for example, you can show in these kind of, sort of little lab studies, you can sort of make people feel like they don't have control over something. Like you make them play this, I can't remember exactly how this worked. You play this sort of video game that you couldn't really win at and you didn't really have control over the controller the way you thought you did. And then you show them a bunch of like random noise and they see and they're more likely like see the patterns. They see patterns in random noise after they didn't actually have control over them, over their actions and things like that, right? And so, and part of it is that the sort of the make, and so what you need to be able to make sense of something, right? So conspiracy theories definitely sort of help you make sense of something, in a way that, and when you can feel more certainty and feel more sense of it, then you can, then it relieves that anxiety. In addition, often in conspiracy, like the QAnon example, right? This is a situation where there's this narrative of Trump, right? He's our leader, but he's also in peril, right? The deep state is going to get Trump, and you guys, the participation nature, where you are actually going to help save Trump from this sort of peril, right? So you're actually like taking an active role. So you're both being persecuted, right? So the QAnon people are both being persecuted. Their leader is being persecuted, and they get to take agency in this narrative of fighting them off, right? And then further, it becomes its own social group. All the people around QAnon, right? Now we're all in this together, and we have privileged knowledge that's just ours, right? And so the social group aspect of ego's beliefs are affiliatory, right? I mean, think about origins of religion, right? What defines our group? Defines our group is that we have these shared beliefs. And so if you are going to sort of going against a certain belief is the same as just sort of leaving your group, right? And so these types of group bond, so those types of conspiracy theories are kind of playing on every level. They're playing at these kind of basic cognitive, I'm happily putting pieces together that don't necessarily fit because I can just kind of do that. They're playing at this social identity level. They're playing at this level of increasing a sense of agency and having a moral narrative. So there are all these different, they're being sort of captured. There are all these different things playing into it at once. I'm sorry, was there any part of it I didn't? And so the COVID. Okay, I can go back to the COVID conspiracy specifically. All right, so now I actually have a bunch of data on, hopefully published soon, on people who say COVID is a hoax. Like, what does that mean? And this data was originally collected in sort of June 2020 or something like this, right? So, or maybe it was July, whatever, but it was sort of early on, right? And one of the things that we were finding is that the people who said COVID was a hoax actually had when we asked them, how likely are you to get sick, right? How much do you think you're going to get sick, or whatever, right? Now, you could imagine if it's June 2020 and people are still kind of denying there's still a lot of public, this isn't really that big a deal. It's just the flu. It's just this. You might think the people saying it's a hoax are going to say, well, I'm not going to get sick, right? But actually, endorsing it as a hoax was completely unrelated to the degree to which people thought they were at risk for becoming sick. But what it was highly related to was stigma associated with COVID, particularly around things. So questionnaires like, I would feel ashamed if I got sick. So the people saying COVID was a hoax said they'd be ashamed if they got sick, even if they were just as likely to think they could get sick, right? And this was related to this quality called psychological reactance, which is a survey where you ask people if they agree with these kinds of statements. When someone tells me to do something, I want to do the opposite of that, right? So it was this combination where people were like, people are infringing on my autonomy. I have a strong emotional rejection of people infringing on my autonomy. And that's sort of creating, and that kind of infringement, and because you're trying to do that with and by telling me I have to stay in my house and you're to do all that stuff, that's the real issue. I just don't want people to tell me what to do, right? And then there's this then there's also this idea of to sort of reject the sort of narratives. You're like, well, I can just be really healthy and fight it off on my own, right? And then there start being all these notions around, Joe Rogan was saying things like, go to the gym, you'll be healthy. You don't, if you're a really healthy person, if you're obese, sure, you're going to get sick. But if you're like a strong man, you won't get sick, right? And so then it gets getting tied up into this kind of quality of you as a
And that's something you can take control over as well, right? Like you're going to the gym as opposed to this kind of non-discriminatory statistical probability of someone just catching it and having heart failure or something.
Right. Yeah. And so then one of the things that happened, right? So early on, there was a lot of people just denying the risk. So in the first couple of months, people just denying that there was much of a risk. But I think they were saying that, right? So what I want to make clear is that they were using language that made it seem like they were denying the risk, but I think they didn't really mean it literally. They were kind of just trying to communicate that, like, they were trying to sort of the misinformation was, I think, was communicated to try to say, well, if you think there's a risk, you're kind of a wuss, right? It wasn't that, and so, for example, but for a little while, right, it's like, like tough guys take risks, right? What's I'm a CEO of a tech company, I take risks, there's this kind of like risk take, and so saying that so then it kind of transitioned to this rhetoric around fear, because what you started, I remember seeing this protest sign that was like, I'd rather die than live in fear, and I saw that, you see all these things in front of these restaurants that say, take your mask off, don't spread your fear in here, right? It is that wearing a mask, so spreading the fear is worse than spreading the virus, right? And so then it gets tied up into these, and so so from my point of view, right, risk mitigation isn't about fear. You're just sort of objectively, I'm just being objective, and like this reduces my risk, so why wouldn't I do it, right? It doesn't feel, it doesn't actually have the effectual quality that, in my sense, not even if I was to say that wouldn't be fun. There's nothing wrong with being scared of something that can kill you, right? You probably should be scared of things that can kill you, right? But but still, so that was the rhetoric. So there was this kind of so going back to it, right? So there's lack of control, right? So sort of tie it back to the other stuff, the kind of lack of control that people were feeling. And the people who were extremely sensitive to that already, so highly reactive people were the people who were most likely to kind of endorse these kinds of conspiracy theory type statements, because they were so sensitive to this kind of infringement of that control. Yeah. So, sorry, have we gone back around to it? All right.
Yeah. So
Okay.
so those are the main sort of mechanisms behind. I guess just to fill in my understanding a bit more, then, just in terms of how that first explanation still ties back into like the COVID case, is the idea behind that one then going to be that people have these like little bits of information, then there's a need to kind of like systematize that alongside, like, for example, the public health reaction of, well, everyone stopped going to work and stuff, how can I make sense of that with the bits that I know? And then people start forming these potentially false explanations where like what the actual vectors of like transmission are is all very new stuff that scientists are working on, and there are like different explanations, and but the general public isn't exposed to that. But I guess then the question is, so how does that lead over time to people coming to a place where they just don't think that COVID is a risk anymore or something, or having some kind of like conspiratorial type explanation?
Right. Yeah. So you're totally right. So there is this. So there's then this idea that, right. So on the one hand, people are just sort of putting these different bits together, but then why are they putting it together in this way versus that way, right? And so there is this note. So then there's this notion of motivated reasoning. So the motivated reasoning account of cognition, right? So basically, there's this distinction: is cognition rational, or is cognition about rationalizing, right? So why do we reason, right? What is the point of reasoning? So some people have argued that the point of reasoning, it basically exists to justify things you kind of want to be true, right? Or when we talk to each other, right? So making arguments is to kind of give someone so it's a justification. There's a justification for this action you already want to take. So, for example, I'll give you one example is like the storming of the Capitol on January 6th, 2021, right? So one way to look at it is Trump said they stole the election. You have to go defend it. And you had a bunch of people who had no previously violent intention, were so outraged by this injustice that they went to sort of act on it. Another way the way this kind of motivated thinking rationalization view of the mind would say is these people are already very angry. They already are very angry at the government for other kinds, and they want to be able, but then they just needed a justification to act on it because they know they can't just say, well, I just can't go up there and just storm the Capitol because
Right.
I
See.
just
Yeah.
got laid off my job or whatever else, right? There, so it's a justification for this desire that they already have, right? And so there's this notion that there's not just a marketplace of ideas, it's a marketplace of justifications or rationalizations where someone go, so in the right, so in the case of, this isn't a real risk, right? I want to do what I want to do. And if there's a good enough explanation, right? So at first, oh, it's just like the flu, right? So you could sort of use something that sounded scientific, like it's just like the flu. Oh, it's not really that big of a deal because they want to be able to go out and do what they want to do, and they don't, and businesses don't want to lose profits because they have to pay workers to stay home on sick leave or whatever motivation it is. There's some sort of justification, but then that they have to, but then there, of course, has to be some level of basis for it, right? When it comes to 500,000 people have died, we can't really say it's like the flu anymore, right? We have to kind of, there has to be some at least superficial plausibility to it at all sometimes, right? I mean, some things are crazier than other things, but at least at like a kind of mass level. And that's one of the reasons I think they switched tactics to this fear-based notion, because okay, well, we can still talk about what it means to be a tough guy or not, because that's sort of independent of what these sort of facts kind of are, something like that, right? And so, but there are these ways in which we're kind of just so people basically willing to pull these pieces together, especially if someone else who has some sort of authority makes it sound reasonable for them, right? Because often if you listen to someone's whole argument, where you listen to certain types of climate deniers, and they can say, well, here's the problem with this study and here's the problem with that, and you can sort of put together, and if you don't have any other information, you might go like, that actually seems totally coherent and reasonable, right? Right. Yeah. It's so that's sort of one way to sort of piece these things together. But also, yeah. So of course, I don't know actually if someone has quite done a study where they've actually integrated. So you did a good job of sort of pointing out, well, there are all these things quite fit together, like the cognitive explanations, other explanations. Often these things are actually done in separate studies, and so how it actually all fits together is still potentially an open question of research. I'm sort of more just sort of these are sort of contributors, all things that sort of contribute to the situation.
Yeah, I think something that I've certainly seen, and so this is obviously going to just be based off of things I've seen rather than any like study or anything, so it could be flawed. Is going to be that I think in communities that seem to have been particularly predisposed to forming like conspiratorial beliefs around like COVID in particular or other issues, would be those communities, like for example Brazilian jiu-jitsu communities, right? And you might ask the question, well, why is that? And I think it's because people in those communities stand to lose the most from policies like lockdowns and things, right? Because it's an activity that's done in person, and people either get their like social status from posting about doing those activities or even make their money from it, right? And so why are there more people in those communities who kind of develop a more conspiratorial view of COVID versus the population outside of those communities? Well, I think the kind of explanation you just offered in terms of the motivated reasoning and stuff can explain those differences that we see quite well, probably in those sorts of cases.
Yeah, right, totally, right. Yeah, they don't want to lose their you don't want to lose your, like, yeah, no, exactly. Yeah.
So I wondered if you could speak a little bit to how it is that these phenomena fit in with people's sort of use of social media throughout, things like COVID, or even, like for forming political beliefs, processing news stories and things.
Oh, right.
And also the role of like online gurus as well as social media. I can ask that question again though if you want to tackle like social media separately and then come
Oh,
back to like gurus. And
sure. Right. So there's a few different, ways. Now it's certainly the case that social media has we're flooded with way more information, right? We always talk about how much more information we're flooded by all the time, right? You just get one news, you had your local newspaper, you read it once a day, that was sort of it, right? And you have, versus all this type of stuff that we're sort of seeing all the time. And, on the one hand, there's evidence that people are actually less in opinion bubbles than they used to be. Where there's this kind of, there's this a very intuitive idea that one of the reasons why there's polarization is because of social media, and we only want to talk to the people that we agree with. But there's also all this evidence that like people only ever really were friends with people they agree with, and you're actually being on social media is how much you're sort of aware that there are all these people who there are all these other people who disagree with you. People actually get into fights on Twitter all the time with people who disagree with them, right? So the role of social media isn't simply via filter bubbles from our sorting, but then there's another aspect, which is what sort of gets engagement, right? So, there's been a lot of, I think, journalism around like YouTube algorithms, for example, where if you're watching something like, oh, what is what is this good diet? And then you're very quickly onto some sort of crazy, some crazy extreme thing there's no evidence for, or, it's something like you watch some, are you sort of skeptical about stuff? And it starts out very reasonably skeptical. So let's say, for example, right, pharmaceutical industries do actually bias research quite a lot, right? Now, not in the way that the vaccines are ineffective. That's actually not a situation that they have, that, the vaccines are, we know the vaccines are effective because also, like, it's outside of the hands of the pharmaceutical industry. You just go around the world, the people who are vaccinated are dying less than the people who aren't, right? The ways in which pharmaceutical industry can bias things have to do with like the trials that they do within the company during like the research, right? And that helps them get developed in the first place. Anyway, but I imagine if you go on YouTube and you were to watch someone talk about bias in the pharmaceutical industries, how many recommendations after that would it be before it was a conspiracy theory about the pharmaceutical industry, right? That would just be, the kind of because the kind of more outrageous, the more outrageous something is, the more attention grabbing it is. And the algorithm supports, it is all about getting your attention as much as possible. And so one of the things I think was interesting, I think my wife actually made this point, where she was telling me, like, think about the tobacco industry or the alcohol industry, right? Now, the alcohol, so to what degree can the alcohol industry thrive if there was no problem drinking? Right? So some people just have a couple of, they don't drink during the week. They have 2 glasses of wine on Friday, whatever. Right? But what percentage of the industry is actually, or gambling? What percentage of the gambling industry isn't just you and your mates betting on the Super Bowl once a year, but it's actually people who are like seriously, the serious problem, right? So one of the questions around social media is it actually a viable business if
people have a healthy relationship to it?
Right. If you actually have a healthy relationship to it, right? And it isn't, right? So is it possible, is it only profitable if they're constantly feeding you crazier and crazier stuff to keep you more and more hooked, right? So yeah. So, I think there's a sort of economic, so that part is a big problem. But also we got to remember how much traditional news is a big part of disinformation, right? So, I mean, remember the New York Times told everyone Iraq, had weapons of mass destruction, right? So, and the Russian trolls on Facebook had less of a role in getting Trump elected than just like the newspapers and news media did, right? So, so even though social, there's a certain type of conspiracy theory rabbit hole that social media can sort of lead you down, we don't want to overestimate the role of social media compared to other sources of media, or just local news. I talk about this a lot. Local news just like reads police propaganda as if it's new, right? In America, there's local news stations just like, oh, the cops, we need to, we have to give the cops more money because what was this thing in Halloween? That Halloween, there was going to be, every kid in America was going to die from fentanyl in Halloween candy, right? The news just talked about that for a month, and there was not a single example of that, right? So So there's these explicit disinformation things. Of course, social media, so we still have our own sort of issues, because there's certainly a social motivation where often we like sharing things with people for the social, it's the whole thing where like, I'm going to retweet this even though I didn't read it, because like I'll look kind of interesting if I retweet it, right? So there's particular motivations that social media tap into in addition to these sorts of algorithmic incentives that create its own set of problems. But right, it's not like it's the there's still lots of bad info out there for other kinds of reasons. And I mean, the guru thing is sort of its own interesting thing, because people are building this kind of audience, and part of it, right, is like, well, I mean, I guess, is it better than, what's it being compared? I mean, people always like going to these, I don't know if, I mean, I guess the way in which they're reaching people is different, but the idea that there are these kind of guru people to go take all your advice from is certainly not a new phenomenon. But I'm sorry, was there a particular aspect of it that?
So I guess I was thinking about I can point to a few kind of examples that stick out in my mind, right? So one of them might be when it comes to vaccines specifically. So someone like Joe Rogan, has maybe one mainstream type voice on to 4 or 5 sort of heterodox opinions on vaccines on. But then I think that sort of thing might give the audience a kind of impression, of like the actual debate amongst the relevant authority, right? The scientists who study this thing is the sort of mapped to the proportion of the conversation that they've seen, this like tiny amount of the orthodox story and this like large amount of disagreement. And then I think there are other things I see at play as well. So there was that YouTube channel with Dr. John Campbell where he started, at the start of the pandemic. I think he became quite popular because he was saying like, here's the number of deaths, here's ways you can protect yourself or your family, like wash your hands. Here's how I was taught to wash my hands as a doctor or whatever. He got quite a large audience. But then I think you've seen this trajectory over time of maybe this selection effect created by trying to get the audience's attention, where over the span of 2 or 3 years, he becomes almost full on vaccine denial. We've been lied to, ivermectin, and so, and it's like all of these, but it's like, how do you explain that trajectory from sort of a quite orthodox position to like this very fringe thing? And I think maybe there's this audience capture type thing at play. I mean, it's difficult to, I'd have to look more at like comparing different explanations, I guess. But one explanation is that
that certainly does make sense. And there is certainly, and one of the things I think is important is that sometimes people might be right that there's something missing in the main, right. So if you're kind of accurately identifying, let's say, that there's something missing in the explanation out there in the world, then then there's this whole waiting for some other kind of thing, and just kind of denying, because I often, and sympathetic to, let's say, people just saying, oh, I don't like the sort of CNN version of things, or, like we're sort of saying, it was mainstream media that said, weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, right? So once you sort of think that there's some traditional sources of information that can't really be trusted, you don't really know how to make sense of things, then why not, get into, then there's sort of there's a sort of opportunity for someone else to sort of make sense of things for you. And then you're right, then you have to keep on differentiating yourself, right? Yeah. Is it simply just, you have to differentiate yourself some way, but you also aren't the crazy guy, right? If you start with these sort of things you can't disagree with and go from there, you're not starting from a place, you're sort of building the trust first, right? And once you sort of build that trust, and then you sort of go, oh, well, that's sort of reasonable. I mean, there was a guy, it wasn't quite, it was funny. So Australia had this particular context where before the vaccine, people were actually, the media was often like overly yelling about lockdowns, right? So there was, these media people who it would be during the lockdown period. And then there'd be because there was a period where people were allowed to go outside. And, there was a period where we were like, okay, you can go outside within a 5-kilometer zone of your house. and the people who live near the beach were just sort of going to the beach. And then you'd have these people going by and have a videotape and be like, look at these people going to the beach during the pandemic. This is why we're still in lockdown, because they're not taking this seriously. And the media was telling the government to like be harsher on lockdowns. And some of these people were people who were, and some of the people doing this were these medical type people, right? And they were kind of ignoring, and they were even not really thinking about a few different things, like the whole outdoor how at that point there was very, very little outdoor transmission, but pre-Delta there was very little in Australia outdoor there was almost like no recorded case, because before it started, Delta was spread much more easily. The previous the original variants like were had very little outdoor transmission, and so actually the science said it was fine to go to the beach, right? But they were sort of mad about, right? And so so you sort of it was sort of a unique place where we were like where the journalists were, it's different than the government, it's the other way with the journal. It's not like the journalist is saying the government's trying to keep us locked in, but it's actually all bullshit. Anyway, but yeah, right. But a lot of people, but some of the people started from this position of like just communicating the science and being very and seeming like being maximally risk averse was the important thing. They also did these fucked up things where they like locked, where like there was initial outbreak in this apartment block full of migrants, and the cops like locked them, like barricaded them in to prevent like spreading, right? And that's not something they would do, right? And this was sort of done in the name of risk mitigation, right? But then people were like, you wouldn't have done that to an apartment full of white people, right? And so, well, sorry, yeah. And so there's a certain, anyway, so the point is that it can sort of go in these different directions. Yeah, sorry. Now I'm sort of, so I've lost a bit of what would lead, but right. But I mean, I think around audience building, differentiation, and then the sort of privileged knowledge, and also when you're getting, it sort of relates to the conspiracy theory thing, where you kind of, what part of it is that you think part of the social status of your group is that you have the best information, right? So because often what we really care about is that we want to be in a group, we want to be part of a group, and we want that group to be high status, right? And then you care about being high status within your group, right? But but if you kind of are building a group identity around these things, having privileged information is part of it. So I think that would be, any one of these individuals, it's hard to say, right? Joe Rogan is a different kind of person because, he is, he'll even kind of say, I'm not an expert in anything, right? He'll kind of have this like, don't listen to me, I'm not a doctor.
Yeah. The plausible deniability of responsibility for making claims, because it's like, well, look, I don't know any better. I'm just some comedian guy. But then it's like to millions of people, like, well, I wouldn't want to put that shit in my body or something. And then, all of a sudden there's a lot of people thinking, maybe I shouldn't get the vaccine now. Or, Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Especially because he's this kind of symbol of, he's owing to working out, into health, right? When someone appears to be this kind of, especially when health is sort of part of his thing through like exercise and whatever, then it's sort of, even though he's not an expert,
it's like a halo effect type thing going on.
Yeah.
So I wondered then, in terms of the type of research that the group is doing for the various phenomena and explanations and things we've talked about, I guess a lot of people are interested in how it is that we can sort of, I suppose, as individuals, but also collectively as societies, fix these sorts of issues around misinformation, polarization, and like, figuring out what's true, but also, I suppose, reestablishing trust in traditional like epistemic authorities and things. And I mean, maybe the answer is, well, that's kind of, we're working on figuring out what the solutions are. But I mean, are there any kind of tentative solutions that you sort of coming up with about the policies and things that will help around this, or how individuals can help contribute towards that sort of thing?
Yeah, so I think there's a few different promising avenues, right? Well, so on the one hand, the pessimistic side of it is, well, as when there's disinformation campaigns being backed by incredible power and money, there's only so much that social science researchers can do, right? If the whole Murdoch empire is behind it, what? Yeah, but at the same time, so there was a recent study. So there's evidence, there's sort of good evidence now that something called pre-bunking, it sort of works better than debunking, right? Because I was talking before about how the first idea often sticks. And so if you can warn people about a sort of bad, a false claim being made, and explain why it's a false claim, and also explain why these people are motivated to get you to believe this false thing, then it does a pretty good job of after you're exposed to of you not believing it after you're exposed to it. And experimentally, often I think this works better than saying the exact same stuff after you hear it. And they actually recently did this. They published maybe a month ago or so, with a kind of field study on YouTube where they were they were sharing these YouTube pre-bunking videos, and it seemed to be quite effective. So that is sort of good. And so one of the issues is, okay, and I'm actually part of a proposal. We'll see how it goes. I'm sure many other people are thinking similarly, where, okay, what you want to do is you clearly have to start detecting what pieces of misinformation are going to blow up, right? Because at the same time, there's lots of I want to make clear, there's so much bullshit out there that has no effect, right? We sort of focus on the ones that take off, but people say people make claims all the time. And everyone's just like, no, that's not true, right? So there's all kinds of stuff that that doesn't take off. And so then what you got to do? Well, if you're going to take time to create this pre-bunking message, right, you have to then actually, you have to then, detect what's actually worth designing that pre-bunking message for. And then there's other things around clear communication, because even though, for example, there are these official guidelines that people have come up with, like, here's how public health communicators should communicate about stuff. Here's the kind of consistent, open, and transparent messaging that helps build trust in the government. And even though these guidelines sort of exist, people actually implement them extremely variably. So in the pandemic, you can sort of point to some governments where people did this well, and other governments where they didn't. And people are still working on how to actually make sure this happens. Now, this stuff, however, both of those ideas are still from a expert to audience direction, right? So that's expert to, so that is, I'm the expert who's creating my pre-bunking video. I'm the expert, whatever. Now, however, a lot of the stuff, makes it harder because it really requires dialogue. So this guy, Lee McIntyre, wrote this book on how to talk to a science denier, and he went to a flat Earth conference and things like that. I don't know, maybe even talked to him. And one of his conclusions was, once you build trust with someone, they actually are very open to the evidence, right? And how you build trust with someone is you have to actually listen to them, right? You have to actually listen to what their motivations are, why, and where they're coming from, and how they got to this situation. And then once you get there, then you can start having this dialogue. If you're just like, hey, you idiot, take the vaccine, right? That's not necessarily that convincing. Now then there's the issue of, well, how do you scale that? Right? There's the issue of scalability, right? So because if and so one thing I would, so you could imagine a world where you kind of have canvassing, right? Where you have like grassroots canvas organizing, but in the sort of direction where you're going around knocking on doors, like old style political activism, but for the purpose of, trust in science or other kinds of things, right? That's, it's hard to sort of, but so there, because there's a particular method that people use in clinical. So a motivational interview is this thing in clinical practice around behavior change. So let's say you have an alcoholic who wants to change their alcoholic behavior. You have these motivational interviews where you sort of try to understand their underlying motivations, then identify the barriers to their behavior change, right? And there's actually, and applying these types of methods, perhaps to belief in these other kinds of conspiracies and things like that, could be a good avenue. But this research, making this scalable, these types of things, I haven't actually seen, because that's what I think is really going to be necessary for the reactants, right? I don't know how much just a message from an expert is going to help the reactants, right? You're going to have to build trust with someone with that type of
this is certainly, I mean, this is something that I've found true when I talk to people who have quite deeply held commitments about like flat Earth, or like young Earth creationism and things like that, where it's very unhelpful for me to be like, you're wrong. Here's a bunch of information, and you should feel very silly now for being as wrong as you were, right? Like the way that consistently what actually works with people is like first building rapport so they humanize you and things like that. But then secondly, like asking people questions, and or like I have to, it can be very difficult sometimes because like having these sorts of conversations with people, because you really have to remove yourself from it and like view yourself almost as like a therapist or a counselor for the person, where you're just going to ask them questions about their cognitive process and rationalizations, like, oh, so imagine what would evidence against this claim even look like, right? And then you go, oh, so now imagine you came across this piece of evidence, how much would that change your mind? Because often like everything is geared towards like rationalizing in one direction, and if you can just like get someone to start loose thinking in the other direction, then that's how, like through these questions and things, then that's how you get them to start maybe doubting some of these things.
Exactly. Yeah. No. You're exactly right. I mean, that's exactly the types of conclusions that Lee came in his book. Right. You're doing. Yeah. His thing for sure.
But the thing I find worrying at scale is I personally have no idea how society should like respond to these like broader crises that aren't just on an individual level, because the idea of almost having like government institutions or something where, right, you've got the wrong beliefs, so you need to go to you need to go to therapy now and have a state official change your motivation.
Right. That sounds very quickly. Yeah, totalitarian. Yeah, 1984-ish or whatever. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, is there anything in the group around that, like political policy, or what can be done at like the state level or something like that, that isn't authoritarian and weird, but also helps helps with that communication?
Right, I mean, so one of the, I mean, right. So you could imagine now how they do. So particular policies around, these sorts of profit models. How much could regulating these social media profit models, right, be important? Now, at the same time, you can't just stop. You could never just stop someone like Joe Rogan from being popular, right? So that's sort of different than finding, perhaps, he's such a popular figure, that's a sort of different thing than going down the kind of rabbit hole of increasing outlandishness. But right, yeah, but how, but there are the individual moves you could do. I mean, there's some aspects where you could start saying, I mean, I've seen some things where you're like, okay, well, what if media platforms, what if Spotify, who supports the Joe Rogan podcast, were financially responsible for any deaths caused by people not taking the vaccine because Joe Rogan was skeptical about it? Right now, it'd be hard to find the direct evidence for that.
Link, yeah,
it's fine to find that causal link, right? But you could certainly imagine, regulations like that, right? Yeah, because how can you get at the source of it, right? There's a certain amount of, are there ways to regulate the source, right? Because the government could sponsor really good pre-bunking campaigns, and the government could have really clear messaging, but then could they do anything about, and also, for example, we can also do better transparency on the science side. I sort of also talking about all the things of the pharmaceutical company stuff, right? So, for example, I mean, I think basically all IP around medicine should be publicly owned, and then maybe the pharmaceutical companies can have a role in like commercializing and marketing things. But if all the original IP is publicly owned, then you're not necessarily going to get the kinds of tarnishing of the research. So from the science side, so for example, there is evidence that making the scientific process more open and transparent will increase trust in the scientific process altogether. Because one of the things that we actually have as a challenge, I think, for our position is how do we tell people about the things that the pharmaceutical companies do that are bad without getting them to jump to the anti-vax?
Yes, right.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So how do you sort of balance that? How do you sort of balance that? And there actually was this example of of this anti-vax group sharing this good journalism story about a way in which Pfizer had kind of skirted some clinical trial regulations. And then because it was being shared by this anti-vax group, Facebook flagged it as misinformation,
Right. Yeah.
even though it was actually good information. Right. Right. Yeah. So right. So things like making science, so some people think if you make the scientific process more open and transparent and trustworthy in the first place, then that will sort of help. Also, once a government's doing things to build trust. So for example, just even having done another way you can do it. One of the things that predicts vaccine acceptance is people trusting their doctor and trusting that their doctor will listen to them. Right. So what structural things we do to increase people's trust? How is the nature of health insurance such that people don't have relationships with their doctors anymore? People used to have relationships with their doctors. They had a doctor, you had the same pediatrician your entire life, and then you had a doctor as an adult, right? The fact people don't have relationships in their doctors anymore, is potentially a problem that leads to the spreading of certain types of misinformation, right? So there's all kinds of relationship building that I think we can be doing that's sort of indirect, right? And then there's also things around like, better economic conditions, right? So one of the reasons why conspiracy, there is a sort of, when people lack agency in their lives, a big reason for that is because it has to do with their economic situation. Right. So they're all, so these are all indirect, right? Not real, but like there's all types of social structures that we can, because there is evidence that conspiracy theories are more endorsed during times of unrest. Civil unrest leads to more conspiracy theory endorsement. I've seen sort of studies like that, right? So there are all kinds of things we can do around building relationships, regulating these social media platforms. Yeah, but it's going to take like a 100-pronged approach, I think, right? And there's always going to be a moving target element to it, because there's always going to be these sort of, there's the whole history of, there's a whole history of snake oil salesmen coming around to your town to show you their new medicine for their, the cure or whatever, right? So the degree to which, eliminating that entirely, it's probably going to be impossible, but we can do our best, I guess. Yeah.
So I've had a few questions from the audience as well, if you've got time, because I am cognizant
right.
of. I'm cognizant of. Obviously, we've been talking a while, and I don't. If you've got like any deadlines or anything. Let me know.
I guess it is 7 p.m. here. I'm probably supposed to have dinner kind of soon, but that's with wife. But that's all right. But I can talk for a little bit.
Okay, sure.
Yeah.
So we'll go through them, and I'm just going to turn off my radiator after I ask the question as well, so I actually, energy prices and things. So the first question is, I didn't understand how pre-bunking would work. Most conspiracy theories are pretty out there. How can they be preempted?
Right. That's a good point. Well, there's new ones all the time, unfortunately. So, I mean, I can give you this one example, where so one of the first studies on, or one of the first kind of recent studies on this, there was a particular petition sort of being sent around that was like, here are 10,000 scientists who deny climate change or human caused climate change, right? And there was evidence that it was being passed around and then affecting the people who were who had seen it, but it's still actually it was still a small sample of people who had, right? And so this particular document, right, was then there was this pre-bunking kind of message that was, okay, if you actually look at it, these 10,000 names, some of them are clearly not real because it includes names like Charles Darwin, right? So some of these people aren't real people. Also, what they're defining as a scientist is anyone with a bachelor's degree in science. So, for example, it could be someone who's a lawyer who had a degree in science, but who's not a climate. These aren't like expert climate scientists, right? So the pre-bunking had all this kind of stuff in it, and it kind of showed that after they did that, that particular thing was kind of, sort of lost its power to the people who were exposed to it later. But you're right, that particular study didn't stop climate change denial in general. It like helped to thwart that particular piece of that particular part of the story, right? It wasn't you're right. If there's something like, the conspiracy theories that we all know about already, it's kind of too late for the pre-bunking for those things. But there's kind of new bad information that's being disseminated all the time, and it'd be more about the pre-bunking would have to just be for those sort of new bits of information.
Thank you. Titan Uranus asks, are you familiar with Mr. Accidentith?
Oh, sorry, I'm actually now forgetting it, but I think somewhat. And the name is familiar, but now I'm actually...
He's a philosopher. I think he's in Australia somewhere, actually, who touches on the philosophy of conspiracy theories.
Oh, yes. Yes. Oh, yeah. Right. Yeah, sorry. I've actually... Right. Now I do remember reading their website. Yes, about that. That was right. But now actually not remembering the details. But right, I remember thinking it was interesting and wanted to go back more to it later. But yeah.
Yeah, I can't remember any of the specific things he does though. But I think the position he takes is sort of, that kind of middle way of saying, people are sometimes like justified in like conspiratorial thinking, but also other times not. And I think, yeah.
Oh yeah, that's right. Because there are real conspiracies, right? I mean, there are real world conspiracies. So there is a problem where we don't want to say just because we tend to only call things conspiracy theories when we mean the not real ones, right? But there are, if we think about all the times America supported coups, right? These are like deep state supporting coups in Latin America, that type of stuff, right? They, those things happen. Was it Volkswagen really did have this conspiracy around, cheating these emission laws, right? There are these real conspiracies that sort of happen. And it's certainly true that there are ways in which these kind of unreal conspiracies seem to be quite similar to real conspiracies. But then there's the issue of, if you kind of push further on the evidence in some way, is there eventual hole in them, right? Because there has to be some point where we have some kind of agreement on what counts as a good evidence for something. But it's true. The structure of the conspiracy theory itself isn't necessarily intrinsically problematic, right? It's just whether or not after you sort of start looking into it. I mean, one thing, it's kind of like, so there was the lab leak hypothesis with COVID, right? And there was a point where it seemed pretty plausible to me, right? Then there were these people, saying, if you think this, it's just because you're racist. And then, but there actually was all this good reason. We're like, well, there is this coronavirus lab, there, and that's a weird coincidence. And then there has been, then after this was raised, there was this later paper that came out that actually was like, I thought was then pretty convincing. This was like a year and a half into the pandemic. That was then pretty convincing against the lab leak hypothesis. But it seemed there was a while when it kind of seemed reasonable, right? And, but then it's like, well, now this evidence has come out that now there's good evidence that it's not. Are you still holding on to this, right? Or, right, because the idea that, that something like, right. So I think that what we sort of mean to, but we also know from that scientists don't just give up their theories once there's counter evidence either, right? So you can sort of look at it as well, where the supposed most rational people or whatever, right? You have a scientific theory, right? And then you have some piece of evidence, and then you explain it away somehow, right? You have some sort of counter evidence to your theory. Scientists do this all the time, where they kind of reinterpret evidence against their theory for, in lines of their theory, right? So any individual scientist could also be doing this, what we might call conspiratorial, rational resistance to belief change. But right, yeah. So if this philosopher is someone who sort of compares the epistemology of conspiracy theories with what we call good theories, and the point is right. You can find much more commonalities than you might think.
Right.
If that's one way to think about it.
Another question is, how does adding to the government help when a lot of conspiracy theories are anti-government?
Right. That's a good point. Yeah. So that's also one of the reasons, right? So you would have, in that sense, the government just has to do a better, right? So how can the government build trust in people, right? So you couldn't then have the government so the government can fund a researcher or something like me or whatever to do something, and then the degree to which you see a researcher as an extension of the government because of that funding, I guess, is its own issue. But it's true. You could certainly use that to reject. Yeah. So actually, one of the things that conspiracy theorists do, is that you have a reason to doubt the evidence, right? So, for example, right, if the pharmaceutical companies, if the pharmaceutical companies are the people who come up with the vaccines, and then they're also the people doing the research. Hey, here's more research. The vaccines are good. Will that come from the pharmaceutical company? Right? You can't trust it if it's coming from the same source. The same type of thing here. Surely right. And so in that sense, the government has a much harder job to do, which is just to build sort of trust more generally. And there's different ways that you might do that, which is, for example, improve people's material conditions is one sort of thing you can do is actually have policies that help people's lives. If you actually have policies that help people's lives, that might help build trust. And that's not a direct counter to any specific conspiracy theory, but that would sort of, it would sort of reduce the risk of them working. But you're also totally right that, in certain sense, I'm a conspiracy theorist. I do think that, the government is behind all kinds of things. It just tends to be the different kinds of things that officially called that. Right, but the government can also, for example, if I was talking about doctors forming good relationships with their patients, right? You could have government policies around health insurance, healthcare that support doctors forming good relationships with their patients that won't feel like it's some sort of government, oversight. There's some sort of totalitarian thing in that way, I guess.
And then just a last question then is the efficacy of childhood education to prepare kids to identify misinformation. So I guess the question is there any evidence for this, and what does that look like?
Yeah, I have seen, I have actually seen this stuff. Now off my head, I'm forgetting it, but I remember seeing that there has been some good stuff about this where you can train, where I remember seeing this kind of animation that people had made for kids. It was developed by these health communicators. And I saw some studies showing it would work pretty well. Now, one of the issues is there's always a sort of issue of expertise where some of us, there's only so much you can do until you know enough, right? But you can, you can certainly help kids sort of help distinguish sources of information. What's a good source of information? What's a bad source of information? What types of tricks are people looking for, right? So you can sort of imagine, can you sort of do a more general right? Not just pre-bunking specific messages, but pre-bunking the kinds of forms that misinformation takes. I have seen, I should probably go back and find these studies. I have seen some attempts to do this. There's general things like critical thinking skills. So one thing that you actually can do. So one thing that you can teach is being better at interrogating your own level of knowledge. Remember I talked about the sort of illusion of explanatory depth stuff, right? So you can actually instruct people around being, how confident should I be in this idea? Right. And so if you sort of, if you come across an idea and you kind of say, well, how much, and then you kind of think of your own understanding. So one way to filter it might be getting people to be less, sort of epistemically skeptical about yourself in a way. but not in a way that means I therefore have to listen to everyone else openly, but in a way that, like, as you're attempting to internalize something, right? How much do you sort of interrogate your own understanding? And there is some work from outside the information space that you can actually from other parts of cognitive psychology than particularly around misinformation, but particularly around how to kind of train kind of better metacognitive skills where you're sort of better at interrogating your own understanding of things, which I think is actually important. And I've done some outreach with high school and younger schools, sort of talking about some of these things. There's some work around logical fallacies and these other kinds of things that people might play into. And how much success there is an open question, I guess. But yeah, I think certainly people are wanting to go this way.
Awesome. Thanks for answering those questions, and thank you for your time as well, coming on to do this interview off the back of a random email that you received.
No, I appreciate it. It's always fun. It's great to talk to your audience. It's great to be on here, and thanks a lot. It really very thoughtful.
Is there anywhere, just before I end it, is there anywhere you'd want to direct people to? I mean, is there like a blog that you have, or a book or anything? It's also fine if there's not, but if there's anything that you would want to promote with people who've just listened.
Right, yeah, so true. I actually haven't written my own kind of book on this topic. I mean, I think if you're interested in cognitive science, even if it's not directly about misinformation, I think there's a couple of really interesting books that tap into relevant research that are best. I mean, some of these are like already kind of best-selling books that I just think are good on certain things. Like David Epstein's Range actually cites some of my research, but that's more about expertise. And so that's about how people should have varieties of experiences in their education and all kinds of things of life. I think it does a really good job of talking about a whole area of cognitive science that actually touches, some of it's related to this, but not exactly. The Knowledge Illusion by Fernbach and Sloman Sloman and Fernbach is actually a lot about that illusion of explanatory depth. The illusion of explanatory depth is a big part of the knowledge illusion book. They don't quite get into some of the social, when I was talking about the sort of the feelings of control, the those types of stuff, it's pretty cognitive, but it does do a pretty good job talking about these things. I guess I should have my own thing to promote here, but
it's fine. Don't worry. It's all right. Just referring people onto other things, other topics. Yeah. Right. Well, thanks for that. I'll end the stream there. And thank you everyone for listening.